So Patrick, welcome to the desert. I know you've been here before, but I think this is your first time at the festival.
It is. It's great to be here.
And I think where you actually live, it's a little colder than this.
My kids have a snow day today. They're very pleased.
So if you don't know Patrick already, staff writer for The New Yorker, celebrating 100 years, right? The New Yorker?
The New Yorker is celebrating 100 years.
Yes, that's right.
I'm celebrating 20 next year. Yeah.
Author of Empire of Pain, about the Sackler dynasty, Say Nothing about a Murder in Northern Ireland, which is also a Netflix series,
Hulu.
Correct? On Hulu,
Yep.
Okay. The books are excellent, the series is fabulous. But first I want to talk about, you have an undergraduate degree from Columbia, and then if that's not enough, Cambridge International Relations, London School of Economics, and if that's not enough, you come back to the United States and go to Yale Law School, right?
We can all become judges after we get a law degree.
So how did you go from that to a journalist?
So I had a kind of a, probably a slightly unusual experience in that I knew actually from high school roughly what I wanted to do. We had, and it was, in fact, it's interesting that we're here in a library. My high school library, this is outside Boston, had a periodicals room. It's funny, when I talk to young people today and I talk about a periodicals room, they look at me blankly. The periodicals room is your phone. But it was this room where they had all the latest magazines up on the wall. And my mother would pick me up from school, and when I was waiting for her, I would wait in the periodicals room. And at some point, when I was probably 16 or 17 years old, I took the New Yorker off the wall, and I started reading it. And I was so immersed in this kind of story, which felt different from anything I'd encountered before. You know, I'd read novels, and I'd read short stories, and I'd read newspaper articles and nonfiction books, but never like an 8,000-word nonfiction story that feels like a story with characters and a beginning, middle, and an end. But it's not as big a commitment as a book. You're kind of in and out. And I, in high school, announced not just that I wanted to be a journalist or a magazine journalist, but that I wanted to write for The New Yorker. And I remember my mother saying, "Well, good for you, honey. You know, you." And it took me many, many, many years to engineer that. So I went to college. I started pitching The New Yorker in college, and they were rejecting all my pitches. And then I kind of liked being in school.
Well, pitching, by mean you were submitting articles.
I was submitting articles to them, and this is so long ago that I was doing this in paper. I would print out the articles and put them in an envelope and send them to The New Yorker in Times Square. And I just couldn't make it happen. And I liked being in school. I went to grad school. And the woman who at the time was my girlfriend was going to go back and go to law school. And so I kind of followed her to law school thinking, this would be my cover
why
story.
you went to law school. So
Yeah.
this
It was
a
for
good
love.
story.
I went to law school for love.
And you stayed 3 years, though, right?
Yeah, it's a very expensive way to find a wife. But so I did law school, but after years and years of pitching magazines and with no luck, I sold a book. I sort of did it backwards. I got a book deal for my first book at the end of my first year of law school. So I took a year off to finish that book. And then when I came out, that's when I started writing for The New Yorker.
Wow. And have you practiced law?
I was a summer associate at a law firm for 3 months and never looked back.
But, you know, I mean, I had lots of friends who went to law school and never practiced law, but used their degree or the study of law in some way. So do you use it in your writing?
Yeah, I do all the time. I mean, in a bunch of ways. I think that part of the reason I wanted to go to law school in the first place was I thought it would kind of teach me how to think in a really analytical way and how to do a certain kind of research. And a lot of my stories have a legal angle. And as a reporter, I'm always looking to tell a story that is a good story, first and foremost, that's just a good yarn. And I'm looking for, whatever the situation, whatever the scenario, I'm looking for the little opera that's hiding inside there with real characters. And I want to keep you turning those pages. But kind of paradoxically, one of the places that I find a lot of the greatest stuff is in what to somebody else might seem like really dry legal documents. And so hiding inside a legal deposition or a transcript of a case or a court case that I actually get to go and watch myself, there's a reason that we have courtroom dramas, right? There's a kind of theater there. And there's also all kinds of little goodies that end up getting attached as exhibits to documents. I mean, to give you one example, I wrote this big book about the Sackler family. And I didn't write it, thank you. I didn't write it with the Sackler family's cooperation. In fact, they were threatening to sue me the whole time I wrote the book. But so then how do you write about a family if they won't talk to you? You want it to seem like you want to get a good feel for who these people are and how they sound and so on and so forth. And so you can find depositions, you can find people who know them, people who've worked for them, friends of theirs. But in these legal filings, in a bankruptcy case, I found, for instance, a WhatsApp log. Like many of you probably have group chats with your own family members, so the Sacklers do too. And they had one of these group chats on WhatsApp, and it ended up getting attached as an exhibit. It was subpoenaed and attached as an exhibit in this court filing, and nobody really noticed this. It was just kind of hiding in the bankruptcy court. And it's all this back and forth among the family members. There's actually an incredible moment in it when Mortimer Sackler Jr. is talking about how there's all this litigation now, and they're really starting to feel the heat, and the press is looking at the family, and he says, we've all got, it's getting hot out there, we've all got to be really careful. Let's keep this conversation where it's safe, here on WhatsApp. Which, if you're me and you get that, you're just like.
So can you see why I like him? Did you see his face light up when he said court documents? That's my life.
There you go, right,
so
exactly.
I read that in one of his interviews, and I said, Jamie, I got to interview him. So your previous books were kind of about a single event or a single person. So why now Rogues, about 12 different individuals?
So I had, partially because I mentioned earlier, I grew up reading The New Yorker, and New Yorker writers used to often publish these collections of stories, which I loved as books, and they don't do it as much anymore. I think in part, I don't want to give away any trade secrets, but in part because you can get them all for free on the internet. And so, it's like the idea of a book with these stories maybe is sort of less of an obvious sell for a person who wants to go hunting them down. But I love the coherence. It's like a book of short stories by an author you love, right? The coherence of a book that's kind of putting together the greatest hits of a certain period of time by a certain writer, and you can see these themes running through and these preoccupations. And part of what I love about my job is that I'm a little bit of a professional dilettante. I don't have a beat. I don't have one subject that I keep writing about. I can, I can sort of zig and zag from one thing to another. What was interesting about putting together this collection, where it was, let's pick 12 stories from the last 12 or 15 years, the ones that mean the most to you and the ones that you feel like resonate the most strongly, is going back to collect them, I realize I actually do have these preoccupations that I keep coming back to. And so it's kind of crime, corruption, the power of personal charisma is a big one for me, that you have some of these people who have such a strong kind of force of personality that they come in and sometimes they bend the rules, sometimes they break the rules, sometimes they invent a new industry where one didn't exist before. And I love getting into those stories. I find those very compelling. And so the idea, I think, was to kind of pull these together and, and have it feel a little bit like a body of work. It's also for some people, my books are these great big, it's an undertaking to read Empire of Pain. This is a little bit more of like it's a buffet.
So it's called Rogues, True Stories of Grifters, Killers, Rebels, and Crooks. So even before you read it, if you haven't already, you can see that it has some interesting and dangerous people. So can I read to you a quote from your wife?
Uh-oh. Please.
That I saw in one of the interviews. She says, quote, "Every time he tells me a new story, I feel like I'm going to have a mini heart attack. Oh, gee whiz, another litigious asshole or murderous criminal. Why can't you just do a celebrity profile?"
Yeah, so my wife did become a lawyer, and I joke that she's my in-house counsel. It's always a conversation between the two of us.
I mean, these are scary. Half of these people are pretty scary people. I mean, you dealt with the Sacklers, Northern Ireland, and a murder. So, why?
Well, I mean, I cannot really explain to you coherently what it is that draws me to a subject or someone. I know it when I hear it. I feel kind of gripped by it. And often I will hear about a story just in conversation, and I know within 30 seconds of somebody talking to me, this is a story. This is it. I gotta follow this. It does. I have a family. I have a wife. I have kids. I'm not a war reporter. I'm not out there, I've got a colleague, Luke Mogelson, who goes off and he's in trenches in Ukraine getting shelled, and I don't do that stuff. But I am writing about people who in some cases are pretty unsavory. And so, as a consequence, you just want to be kind of careful about it. And I will tell you that there's like a little bit of comedy with the way in which this work kind of brushes up against my domestic life. There's a story that we tell my younger son. This happened years ago, but I have two boys, and years ago, it's probably 8 years ago, the younger one was about 4 years old, and his big brother was about 7, and his big brother did karate on Saturday mornings. Bunch of little 7-year-olds doing their karate chops. You're familiar with the picture. And I would always take him. This is a thing that I would do. And I would bring the little guy to give my wife a break on Saturday mornings. The little guy would sit on my lap. I would sit cross-legged, and he would sit on my lap. And we would just watch his brother's karate class. And what he did during that time, this is at a time when he loved this. He could do it for hours. I would give him my phone, and he would open the text messages. And he would just send my wife emojis, like long strings of emojis, just all these little pictures, and then she would get the emojis, and she would write back, bear, 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 heart, 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 fireworks, fireworks, fireworks. And he loved this. It could occupy him for a solid 45 minutes while his brother was doing karate. And one morning, I'm watching a little tuned out Saturday morning. I'm still tired. He's sitting in my lap doing the emojis. The older boy's doing karate. And then suddenly I hear this kind of dissonant sound. Something's weird. It's that thing where your brain your brain knows before you know consciously that something's a little weird. I'm hearing something. I realize my son seems to be on the phone with somebody. And I look over his head, and he's opened FaceTime on my phone, and staring up at him is the former Juarez lieutenant of the Sinaloa drug cartel. and this guy's face fills the screen. And my cherubic little 4-year-old is staring back at him. It was one of those things where I couldn't tell which of them was more surprised, to be honest with you. And for the Sinaloa guy, the other thing is that it's this little chubby-faced kid looking at him who are you, And then in the background, it's 20 little kids going, Kia! Doing the karate. So I had to kind of hastily, I hung up quickly, and then I had to call him later and say, listen, I'm so sorry about that. He was very sweet. He said, no problem, cute kid.
So the book has 12 chapters. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason for 12? And is there an order to the 12 as we read through them?
I did think about that. I thought about, I often think about, the thing about doing this kind of work, about writing for a magazine, is that nobody's required to read what I write. And we all have these little distraction machines in our pockets, right, that are constantly vibrating and trying to pull us away from whatever it is that we're reading. So I'm very, very conscious of wanting to grab you right from the start. And I think of it as the top of the water slide. I need to get you over the top of the water slide, and then after that, you're mine. But it's tricky to do that, and it's funny. People sometimes ask who's the reader that I have in my mind when I sit down to write, and for me, that's not an abstract question because I see these people when I get on the New York subway. I see people get on and they pull out the New Yorker and start reading. And there was actually a case years ago where I saw somebody reading my article. And a of course, what I thought was like, should I say something? If any of you have been on the New York subway, you may know it's not the best place to approach a stranger in a weird way. And in this case, I sort of inched over to this woman. She folded over the article. I could see her reading the first paragraph of my article. I was inching over to tap her on the shoulder and say something. And just as I reached out, she got to the end of the first paragraph and she turned to the next article. So I'm haunted by that every time I sit down to write. And so the reason that I started where I started with kind of a crazy story about Chapo Guzman, but then the first piece in the book is about counterfeit wine.
This is a great story. Great
and
story.
It's like the most fun I've ever had in journalism. I wrote the story years. It was my third piece ever for the New Yorker, but it's just a really fun story. It's not quite as dark as some of the later stories will be, and it felt like a good top of the water slide.
Someone who thought they were buying the wine of Thomas Jefferson.
And turned out not to be, yeah.
So I'm a little nerdish, but I'm always interested in the process that authors go through with their editors to pick the title. Because it seems like every time I ask that it's a discussion back and forth, and there's a lot of contention in some sense about what the title ends up being. So how did you end up with the title of this book?
I think early on I liked I was just thinking, I was sort of looking back and I was like, what do all these people have in common? And there is a kind of roguish sensibility. And I should say some of these people are awful people. I mean, it's people like Chapo Guzman. Some of them are white-collar criminals. Some of them are people who aren't criminals at all. It's business people, or there's actually a chapter in the book about Anthony Bourdain, who I spent a year hanging out with and writing about before he died. And rogues just felt like a kind of a, I'll tell you, originally we talked about rogues gallery, but that's kind of a cliche. Like often you find your way to the title by kind of whittling down. So my book, Say Nothing, was originally called Whatever You Say, Say Nothing, which is a famous poem by Seamus Heaney. And my publisher said, that's a mouthful. And so we ended up with Say Nothing.
And Empire of Pain's perfect.
Empire of Pain, I was pleased with that. We talked about House of Pain. You always think about these kind of. It's funny. So I'm working on this book now that I'm hopefully going to finish fairly soon, and my working title for the book is The Oligarch's Son. And I remember about a year ago when I told my book editor I want to call it The Oligarch's Son. He said, "Americans wouldn't know what an oligarch is."
No more to be said. So did you have to pay any of these individuals to talk to you?
You can't do that. You can't do that. There are kind of rules of the road with this kind of writing, and one of them is that you're never allowed to pay for interviews. There are workarounds. I mean, years ago I wrote a book about Chinatown, and I was writing about people who work incredibly hard, these Chinese immigrants who work they take one day off every 2 weeks. And when you're me and you're making the case for why they should talk to me, it's like, why should you take an hour out of your day when you're making money for your family to talk to me? I can't pay them. I could buy them a meal. And so there are workarounds like that where you can, it's like a small thing, but within the ethics of the profession, it's okay to buy somebody a meal if they sit and talk with you. In fact, what you're not allowed to do is let them buy you a meal, because then they might influence you. Occasionally people abuse this. There's a guy right now for my book that I'm working on now, is a gangster in England. And
Not a celebrity.
The last time I went and saw this guy, we went to this kind of high-end Chinese restaurant, and he proceeded to order everything on the menu. Like clearly he was going to get everything he could out of this transaction. But no, I'm not allowed to pay.
So I'm interested with how you even got some of these individuals to talk to you at all. I mean, you're a reporter. They had to have known that you were going to probably write some article about them. So kind of two questions, and I want to start with El Chapo, because one, he's probably one of the most dangerous of ones. But how did you get him to talk to you? And tell us a little bit about that. I don't want to go through each chapter by chapter, but there's some I do want to talk about because they're so interesting. But how did you get him to talk to you?
Well, Chapo didn't talk to me, per se. So initially when I wrote about him, he had just been captured in Mexico. He was in prison. For those of you keeping track, this is before he broke out and then was locked up again. And that was what we call a write around, which is when you don't have access to the person, but you kind of write around them. And some of you may remember there's a famous Gay Talese story called Frank Sinatra Has a Cold, which is like the kind of classic write around where he doesn't have access. He doesn't get the interview with Sinatra, but he writes the story anyway. And I did a kind of a Frank Sinatra Has a Cold with Chapo Guzman, looking at court transcripts of people who worked for him who'd been captured, interviewing people who'd worked for him, interviewing Mexican law enforcement and soldiers and intelligence people who'd gone after him, interviewing a lot of DEA agents and people on the US side who tracked him. And there were wiretaps. There's all kinds of things that you can do to bring somebody to life. In the case of that story, the thing that was funny is that I published it, and I didn't give much thought to the idea that Chapo Guzman would read it. For a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that he was sort of famously illiterate. He dropped out of school in the 3rd grade or something. I figured out when I was doing my reporting that he actually could text in Spanish. He could do a kind of minimal texting with people. So he could read a bit. But he didn't strike me as like a New Yorker subscriber. And and I had put some things in the piece that, in retrospect, he might not have been thrilled about. And I didn't really anticipate. So what happened is the article came out, and then it was picked up in every newspaper in Mexico, and with these very inflammatory headlines that were like, El Chapo loves Viagra.
And that's a great story, and you've got to tell it.
Well, because I had interviewed all these people who were wiretapping him. This is when he was in hiding. He would move from a different safe house to another every single night. He never slept in the same room. There was this complex series of tunnels underneath the city of Culiacan. He would get from one to the other. Law enforcement was after him, and they had to kind of supply him. It was a big logistical thing to keep this guy in hiding, but the thing that was kind of funny is he had his wife and his ex-wives with whom he was still quite cordial, girlfriends, mistresses, prostitutes, and it became a whole thing to just make sure that El Señor had enough Viagra wherever he was. And I interviewed one of these DEA guys who was like, he ate it like candy. And you had this whole thing with the cartel where they're, never mind like keeping him alive or selling drugs or doing any of the other stuff. It's just like, can we get El Chapo his Viagra? So the story comes out. It's picked up in all the Mexican press. I get a call from a lawyer for the Guzman family. And I was very alarmed by this. I did not tell my wife about this conversation. And he left a message initially, and I reached out to a guy who had been a source for me, who was an American law enforcement guy who'd been going after the cartel for many, many years. And I gave him the name of this lawyer, and I said, is this guy a real cartel lawyer, this guy who called me? And he said, I'm going to run the name, and I'll come back to you. And he called me an hour later, and he said, oh, yeah, he's a real cartel lawyer. And he's one of these cartel lawyers where it's like 60% cartel, 40% lawyer. So that got me even more concerned. And then I called the guy, and I didn't know what he was going to be asking about. And what he asked is, would I like to ghostwrite Chapo's memoir? So I said no. But it was tempting because there's somebody who I had done this write around, and I couldn't be in a room with him. And the proposal had been that Chapo had a daughter who lived in San Diego, and she was going to go in and visit him in the prison, and she would talk to him and then come out, and then she and I would go write this book. It was a whole thing. And I was trying to explain to the guy that sometimes, even when it's just like a celebrity or an athlete, or sometimes when you have a ghostwriter, the relationship between the subject and the ghostwriter breaks down. And you're like, I don't want that to be me and Chapo Guzman. So I declined. So I never actually did talk to Chapo, but when the opportunity came, I couldn't summon the nerve.
And where is he now?
Chapo is now in a Supermax here, and I think unlikely to escape.
So it's almost like you need or you have a psychology degree because, I mean, in some sense you analyze these people who may be pathological liars, maybe they're just in denial, maybe they're just out and out evil. So how does that fit into your process of analyzing them and coming to a conclusion?
Excuse me.
Whoa.
Sorry. I didn't realize the mic was going to be right there. I mean, I guess the thing I would say is that it's funny. There's a knock on my work, which is it's not all that prevalent, but occasionally there's a critique of my writing, which says you're humanizing these people, like you're looking at these evil people as humans, and I always kind of resist that on some level in the sense that it's like you're humanizing these human beings. But I guess I would also say that I generally resist. There are people who are just psychos, who are just kind of nuts. And I tend not to write about them because they're not all that interesting to me. What's interesting to me is people who aren't psychopaths, but end up doing really monstrous things. And I'm interested in how it is that they get from where we are, hopefully, most of us. Like, how do you deviate from that path? And I can give you an example. There's a story in Rogues about a woman named Amy Bishop. And this was a woman who was a professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. She was a scientist. She had a PhD from Harvard. And in 2010, she went into a faculty meeting with a bunch of her colleagues. And at the end of the faculty meeting, she pulled out a gun and she shot 6 of them, killing 3 of them. And at the time, this was a big story for a couple of reasons. I mean, one was that it was, I hate to say, at this point, mass shootings are a nearly daily occurrence in the US. And so that in and of itself isn't a news story. But the fact that it was a woman was quite unusual. They tend not to be women, the shooters. And there was a big deal made about the fact that she'd been denied tenure. So there was a sense of like, is the fight for tenure so severe that you would kill 3 of your colleagues? And none of that was interesting to me. She wasn't that interesting to me. But after she was arrested in Alabama, the authorities there got a call from a chief of police in Braintree, Massachusetts, which is a suburb of Boston, not far from where I grew up. And he said, that woman you have in custody, I thought you'd want to know, back in 1986, she shot and killed her little brother with a shotgun. And it turned out that when she was in college and her brother was in high school, she had walked into the kitchen of the family home and shot him point blank in the chest with a shotgun and killed him. And there was only one witness. It was their mother, Judy. And so Judy walked into the kitchen. She had 2 kids, and she watched one shoot and kill the other. And the cops are on the way, and they got to the door, and Judy said, I saw the whole thing. It was an accident. And that, to me, was an interesting story. Amy, the mass shooter, ultimately, and I ended up talking to her, but her psychology is not that interesting to me. Judy, the mother, who in this moment, in this instant, who loses one child and realizes she's about to lose the other and tells the cops it was an accident, and Amy is never arrested and interrogated. She's never charged with anything. She's never investigated in a significant way. She never gets therapy. There's never anything on her permanent record, and she just kind of moves through life. Nobody knows about this thing. She ends up having a child, a son, and she names him Seth, which was the name of her little brother. And none of her friends, as an adult, know that she's named her son after the brother that she killed. And she ends up exploding in 2010. That, to me, was a really rich and interesting story. So it is a thing where kind of the more out-and-out crazy someone is, the less interesting they are to me. The Judy thing, I interviewed all these people who knew her, And it was this interesting moment. I had, at the point where I wrote this story, I had just had, I guess both of my sons have been born, but I had really young kids. And people who knew Judy Bishop, the mother, would say to me, "Do you have children?" They would all ask me that, as if having kids was kind of a prerequisite for understanding the choice that she made.
So I think it's interesting you brought that up on your own, because in one of your interviews you say, if there is one story to read, it is Amy Bishop, and that this is the story that stayed with you. And you've explained some of that, but kind of why is that? Why did this have such an impact on you?
I don't know. It was a kind of, I ended up, this is a good example. This is a story that started as a write-around. Initially, Amy was in prison and wouldn't talk to me, and her parents wouldn't talk to me. They'd never talked to the press at all. They were living, you imagine the horror of these poor parents, right? That you lost your daughter kills your son, and then you try and kind of protect her and preserve a life. She ends up getting married, having kids, and then these years later, she ends up a mass shooter. So the parents were very isolated, and I finally persuaded them to talk to me, and I spent 2 long afternoons with them, separated probably by about a month. And what I found was that they were very, very deep in denial. And denial is a subject that's interesting to me. I'm interested in the stories we tell ourselves to kind of get through the day, the little lies we tell ourselves. And it was hard because, Amy, who was talking to me from prison, had said that she tried to commit suicide. And I asked the parents about that. And I say, she told me that she slit her wrists at one point and had to be sent to the hospital. And they both said, "Oh, no, that wasn't a suicide attempt. It wasn't, no. They were carving pumpkins, and she wanted to see how sharp the knife was. And so she sort of ran it across her wrist, and she ended up in the hospital." So what do you do when you're me? I feel enormous compassion for these people. I feel, on a personal level, incredible sympathy for them. At the same time, the whole subject of my story is like, what happens when you see the bad thing and you kind of avert your eyes out of a sense of compassion or mercy? Like, what bad things can that lead to? And the night before the article came out, I talked to the Bishops. And I remember they should have had a pretty decent sense of where the article was going, because we fact-checked these articles, and so they would have been asked about all this. And Sam Bishop, the husband, said to me, "I just want you to know, no matter what happens tomorrow, that we're happy that we told our story to you." And the next day the piece came out, and they haven't talked to me since. And listen, that lingers with me on a human level, but on a professional level, I wouldn't change a word. Like, I think this is part of what we have to do. Your heart has to be open when you sit and you listen to these people, but then you need to be a little bit bloodless when you sit down to write the story, because, I'm not in the business of, I'm not, in PR, I'm not a psychiatrist. I have to kind of tell the story as I see it.
So for me, that brings up an interesting question, for me anyway. How do you make sure you're not being deceived? And then on the other hand, how do you balance with that you don't become emotionally impacted in some way, that you change what you're going to write? Maybe, you're not as impartial. You have a bias that comes out. How do you guard against that?
Yeah, sort of 2 different questions. The first one is an interesting one, because people lie to you all the time. And I do think that you, over time, become, it's a little bit like a detective or something, or a litigator, where you're always cross-examining the people who talk to you. And so for me, what that means, I have the luxury of time. I can spend 6 months on an article or a year. I can come back to people. I get them to tell me the story again. If they tell me that somebody did something, I'll go off and talk to that person and then come back and say, "Well, it's interesting you said that, Joe said this, because I just interviewed Joe, and he remembers it quite differently." And so you're always having to kind of push it and prod. There's one story in here about a guy who turns out to be a compulsive liar, and I didn't know it. And it was kind of funny. The guy's name was Hervé Falciani. And it had been described to me that he was the Edward Snowden of Swiss banking. He was a guy who worked for HSBC's private bank in Geneva. And one day he walked out with these digital files on all of their clients. And he ended up getting arrested in France. And he said to the French authorities, who were about to send him back to Switzerland, "I have all this information on French citizens who owe hundreds of millions of euros in taxes that they haven't paid. And the French, it was kind of a funny moment where he's in prison at this point, and the next morning, he's still in prison, but the next morning, his guards show up with coffee and croissants for him. Like, things have, his fortunes have changed. And he said, I'm a transparency advocate, and it's terrible, these rich people hiding their fortunes in Switzerland. And so I went to see him in France to interview him, to write this story about the Edward Snowden of Swiss banking.
And you went in with one impression.
I went in with the very strong impression that that was the story I was going to write. The whole thing was a little weird because he also, I flew into Paris. He proposed that we meet at this restaurant, which I'm fairly certain none of you will have been to. But it's like a little chain restaurant in Paris called Hippopotamus. And it's like only in France. It is a steakhouse for kids. And so it's like a place where kids have birthday parties and stuff, and you go in and there's all these like cherubic little beautifully dressed French children, with tiny steak frites. And and then me and the Edward Snowden of Swiss banking. It was like a strange place for him to propose that we meet. And we sat down and talked for 4 hours, and about 45 minutes into this conversation, I thought, I've made a terrible mistake. This guy is a compulsive liar. Nothing about his story makes any sense. I keep asking him these questions, and the answers don't add up. I think he's a thief. Like, I think he stole this data to sell it. And when he got busted, he said, no, actually, this is all about transparency. And I abandoned that story because I thought, how can you build a story around an unreliable narrator? And I came back to New York. I apologized to my editor. I said, well, just put it on the shelf. I can't do that one. And about 6 months later, I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, no, you build it around an unreliable narrator. This is going to be fun. And so the piece is kind of a fun one because you sort of follow him through and you just realize, like, you slowly peel away the levels and you realize that he's not who he pretends he is.
So tell us what, for the reader, for us, kind of what the takeaway is from us, kind of what you're trying to, the theme that you want to kind of run through the book. Is it 12 individuals, or is there something bigger than that?
I don't know that there has to be something bigger. I mean, I think that there are a bunch of themes that I'm interested in. I've always been very interested in what we as a society deem kosher and worth celebrating, and what we deem illegal and worth condemning, right? So it's like, I've written about Mexican drug cartels and I've written about the Sackler family. And our society treats these different people very, very differently. And yet, in both cases, you have people who are enriching themselves by selling a drug that is killing lots of people. And I don't mean to suggest that it's like apples to apples. They are different, but I'm interested in the way in which we treat them so differently. I'm very, very interested in kind of story construction, like the way in which people tell a story about themselves. Like, I love kind of American hucksters. I love hustlers. I love people who go out and tell such a good story that they're able to persuade everybody else that, it's Friday on Thursday and that up is down. And part of what's so intriguing to me about those people is I think the first lie they tell is often to themselves. They wake up in the morning and they say, I'm a good person. Or, I am this, I'm a self-made man, or whatever it is. And that sort of slippery power of the person who tells the best story, either to themselves in the mirror or to the rest of us in the country, is able to prevail often in ways that, sometimes afterwards you're kind of scratching your head wondering, how did they do that?
So you can imagine there was one story in here that I loved, and that was Judy Clark. Tell us a little bit about Judy Clark.
So Judy Clark is a lawyer who is a death penalty lawyer who devotes her whole career to trying to save people from the death penalty. And we all know that there are lots of people who've been exonerated on death row. There's innocent people who've gotten the death penalty. These are not the people Judy Clark is interested in. The people she's interested in are what the Supreme Court has called the worst of the worst. So people who they're guilty, and they're guilty of the most heinous things. She represented the Unabomber. She represented Jared Loughner, who shot Gabby Gifford. She represents really terrible, rapists, torturers, terrible people.
The Boston bombers.
The Boston Marathon bomber. And Judy Clark had never lost a case. She also hadn't talked to a journalist in 20 years. And I was just very interested in the choices that she would make, that she sort of thought the way I'm going to resist the death penalty is to defend the worst of the people, the kinds of people who, even if you oppose the death penalty, you'd be tempted to make an exception for these folks. Those are her clients. And she took on the case of the Boston Marathon bomber. And I knew she wouldn't talk to me, but I thought, this is like, in a way, it's like watching an undefeated athlete. I can sit in a courtroom feet away from her for weeks and weeks, and I'm going to watch her lose because she's going to lose this case. I knew she would. And it was fascinating. It was a kind of strange experience to be, she never gave me an interview, never talked to me, but I sat, as far away from her as I am from you right now for about 6 weeks in this courtroom watching her do what she did.
From watching her for that long of a time period, did you form impressions about her, kind of as a person, as her personality, why she's doing this?
I sure did. I mean, I thought, on the one hand, I thought she's like a deeply moral person, deeply, deeply moral. On the other hand, I thought she's a person with a lot of moral vanity, that there is ego there, no question. And she's a person who really wants to win. And this is another kind of personality trait I'm interested in is people. I find this sometimes with lawyers or with PR people who represent awful, awful clients, that sometimes if you're in an adversarial business, you actually want the worst person. You want the guiltiest person because in a kind of purely competitive way, that's Everest. Like that's the big challenge. And that's a quality that is interesting to me. And I loved watching all that. I love being up close watching somebody who's incredibly good at what they do.
And she was good.
If you feel kind of morally complicated about it, so much the better. So Judy Clark, people refer to her as St. Judy, but it's funny, when I did the audiobook for Rogues, and I spent, over the course of a week, I'm sitting there in a booth, on a microphone, reading the pages. And there was an engineer who was sitting on the other side of the glass the whole time. And this woman her only interventions the whole week she would say, "Can you not cough directly into the mic?" Or, "Can you not, can you put a little too much pop on that P?" No editorial comments at all, except when I finished reading the Judy Clark story. She just looked at me through the glass and she said, "I didn't like that woman." and to me, that's kind of great, right? Because somebody else would read that and think this woman should be canonized. And if she listens to it and has a completely different reaction, then great.
So we just have a couple more minutes, and I want to end with Anthony Bourdain. I mean, for me personally, he's someone I fell in love with from his very first book, from his television shows. And you had an opportunity, I think, not only to interview him, but to become his friend. So tell us a little bit about him and your trip to Hanoi.
Yeah, so I had written a few very dark stories, and my boss, David Remnick, said, how about some R&R? Basically, what would you like to do for fun? And this is kind of ironic in retrospect, given where things went, but I said, I want to travel with Anthony Bourdain. And I pitched it to Bourdain. He was into the idea. I spent a year writing the article, which is, strictly speaking, longer than I probably needed to, but we had a lot of great meals and conversations. We went to Hanoi together, which is one of his favorite cities in the world. And I just thought I've always been very interested in people who change their lives dramatically at different junctures. And I was very interested in the idea that Bourdain was in his mid-40s before he ever became known as a writer, before he ever really traveled or saw much of the world. And as I said, I'm interested in charisma. And boy, that guy was charismatic. He was an incredible guy. I figured out as I was going, there's some dark personal details about his life in the story. As I was writing, I realized that he was in a darker place than I had thought. I had no inkling that he would end up committing suicide. But I'll tell you one little funny story in closing, just because I think it so captures him. At one point, as a journalist, you're always looking for a scene. And at one point, he'd been shooting a scene for his show at a little restaurant in Hanoi, and I was just kind of hanging out across the street. And he comes over to me and he says, "Hey, you want to go for a ride?" And he had a Vespa. And I said, "Yes, I would like to go for a ride with you." And I get on the back of his Vespa, he's on the front, and we pull off into the streets of Hanoi. And if any of you have ever been, Hanoi has about 6 million scooters. And it's incredible. It's like you're joining these kind of floodwaters that like rush in and out of the intersections, and there's cook fires and smoke coming at you and all kinds of stuff. And it was this incredible thing, and I'm kind of clinging to his belly on the back of the Vespa. And what I'm thinking is, I'm the best journalist in the world because this is going to be the greatest scene. I have contrived to get Anthony Bourdain in Hanoi, driving me around on his Vespa. Is this the first scene in the article? Is it the last scene? Can I call back to it? And we end up at the hotel. I go to bed that night, and as I lay my head on the pillow, what I realize is, you didn't do any of that. He gave that to you. That he was a writer himself, and he was a very selfless, generous guy. And he had realized I needed a scene. And so it was this kind of incredible moment where, I'm riding along on the back of the motorbike, thinking I snookered him, and he snookered me.
It's a great book. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you all.
Thanks.